Hi, everybody. My name is Kaitlyn Concilio. I just want to apologize in advance. Years of listening to audiobooks and podcasts at double speed have given me a very distorted sense of appropriate conversational cadence. So I'm going to try to slow down, but if I go too fast, I apologize. In addition to my experience with A-Flight, I have a lot of experience in higher ed, healthcare, nonprofits, and journalism. And so all of those industries have been through a lot of upheaval. And so they've given me a lot of experience with Greenfield projects. And so that was why I wanted to talk about some of the learnings that I found from working with those kinds of projects. So the 4 P's of Greenfield projects, as I call them, are plumbing, process, planning, and paradigm. We'll go into those more in depth as we go through it, but I want to state up front, the point of this is not to wow you with something that literally no one else has ever thought of before. This is more about giving people advantages ahead of time before they get into Greenfield projects. So you're not 3-6 months down the road and all of a sudden you find out, oh, that would have been really helpful to know back at the beginning. So that's what I'm hoping to accomplish here today. So we'll start with what a Greenfield development is. The metaphor comes from the construction industry. So Greenfield development means quite literally you are developing on top of a green field. There is nothing underneath it. You get to build whatever you want, constrained by your imagination, and of course, time and money and all those boring things. As it applies to development, it usually means you're working in a totally new environment. So a clean slate, you don't have any pre-existing code to work with, and you can build only what you're constrained by your imagination. We don't see a lot of total rewrites in this industry as much as we used to for a number of reasons, but we do see a lot of subsystem rewrites, which happen when, hey, I want to build this new feature, but my system can't handle it. So I'm going to build this thing and we're going to build it from scratch because we need to support something different. You also see a lot of transitions back and forth between microservices and monoliths in both directions, actually. And then the ever-present upgrades of frameworks and languages often can sometimes require whole-scale rewrites for at least small sections of projects. I think developers tend to like Greenfield projects more than the other. The counterexample would be Brownfield projects, mostly because they get to write whatever they want. And they'll say that's because they get to do it properly. What it actually means is they get to do it their way. And so developers tend to like that. That's the old not written here philosophy. And of course, the antidote to Greenfield would be Brownfield, which is renovation, which would be updating, extending, and maintaining existing projects, which we also see a lot of. And so to talk about these, I want to talk about 2 recent projects that I worked on. I want to start out by saying both of these companies did agree that we could talk about what we did, but I did give them pseudonyms, mostly because I don't feel like this presentation is an accurate description of looking at all of the entire project. This is just a small piece of those, and it's not fair to try to judge them. So they have pseudonyms. And the other thing I would point out is that both of these projects were successful and that both of them launched on time and are currently in production. So this isn't like these are red flag warnings so much as these are learnings that we can take away from successful projects. The first one I want to talk about is EduTech. So an American educational services company. They work primarily business to business. So most of their contracts are in terms of, we're going to go work with this public school district. And I only say that because that's how we tend to view, or when we talk about their users, yes, they do have individual users, but they think of their users more in terms of collective districts. For this project, they asked us to help with a wholesale rewrite of their existing application front end. They have a product that exists in the marketplace. They wanted it to have a couple of different features. They wanted it to be a little more friendly, so they asked us to come in and help them. The team that they were working with, so 3 A-Fighters came on the project. They had an existing lead developer who spanned both front and back end, so full stack developer, and then 1 developer each that focused on their back end and their front end. And then for this project, they actually brought in 2 junior developers, I think with the hopes of speeding up development and giving them a deeper bench. And we're working with Angular and PHP. Food at Home is going to be what I'm going to use for the other company. So this is an international last mile food delivery company. In other words, click a button on app, food shows up at your door. They had an existing system that allowed them to onboard their delivery partners, and that existing system decided they wanted them to spend a lot more money, and they decided they could do it cheaper if they brought the whole thing in-house and give them better functionality. So it was a rewrite of an existing application, but they didn't even have access to the code for the existing one. So that was why we considered a green light. For that team, they brought in a team of A-Fighters to work on the front end while their existing internal team handled their back end stuff. And so we were working in React while their existing team worked in Java. So the first P we want to talk about is plumbing. And plumbing refers to all existing external expectations and internal resources that you're bringing to bear on the project. Another good word for this would be foundation, but that doesn't start with P, which would screw up my whole alliteration thing. So we're not going to use that. So this is where we get to the first big twist of the presentation, which is with an asterisk. I don't really think that true greenfield projects exist anymore. Software is not developed in a vacuum. The internet exists. You're going to have to interact with it. You're going to have to pull your data in from somewhere. You're going to want to do something with your data. And it's foolish to pretend, oh, we can just do whatever we want. And that's actually kind of the whole point of the presentation, but I wanted to get that up front. Even if you're a software developing a piece of brand new software, totally from scratch with no existing clients, those clients are going to want to do something with your data, or you're going to want to pull in data from somewhere else. And that is plumbing, and it is a constraint you're going to have to consider. So with EduTech, the biggest constraint that we had actually, so again, I mentioned the pre-existing application, because of the way contracts work and the way of the business, they weren't going to be able to migrate all of their customers over wholesale the minute we started this new application. So we were going to have to run both of them in parallel. And because that's the case, and because they wanted to migrate people, they wanted to bring their existing data with them. So they decided that in order to speed up development, we weren't going to touch the back end. So the back end had to, or that's not true. We couldn't modify the back end so much that the existing software could not work with its existing data. We could extend the back end. We could change how we're pulling things out of that back end, but the existing data had to essentially be working properly, and that existing application had to continue working even once we launched the new one. The takeaway for everyone else is, what does my software connect with? That was sort of what I was getting to at the beginning. What APIs am I pulling from? What am I pushing to? These are all going to give you constraints that you're going to have to consider as you're building out your project. The other thing is, so the existing application was built in Angular working with a PHP backend. The new application was built in Angular with a PHP backend. And the reason is that because that's what their team was familiar with. You have to consider who's going to be maintaining your application after it's built. So that's going to be decided by the team you have to work with. You can teach them all new skills. They can learn new languages, they can learn new frameworks, but that is an additional cost you're going to have to consider. So it tends to be, what do I already have the experience in that I can work with? For food at home, so again, we have an existing application. We don't have to consider the application in its current state. So when we're onboarding drivers, we can do whatever we want because that system exists externally. We don't have to connect with it. But though that external system used to connect into their current drivers, and it expects data in a certain format. And so our new application had to be able to meet all those expectations because the data had to be delivered in the same way. So even though the application we were building could do whatever we wanted, we can build it however we want, the ultimate output had to fit, we'll think of it as a pipe connection, the pipe had to fit in the right way. And so the takeaway there is what's happening to my data after I've collected it. The other thing that I want to talk about is UX expectations. So Food at Home has an existing application, works on Android, works on iOS, you can use it in the browser. You expect an application from Food at Home to work in a specific way. You expect it to look a certain way, you expect certain conventions to be observed. Our new application had to meet those expectations. And if it didn't, we had to know why, and we had to explain to the user sort of how to use this and how does it work differently. Those are all constraints you need to take into, again, even though it's a brand new application. The other thing I would talk about is external UX expectations, which I think sometimes, I'm not blaming designers on this one, but you want to design the cool thing, you want to design new things. Users expect forms to work a certain way. They expect when I go to click on this form, when I click on this field, this is what happens. And if you don't meet that expectation, you're going to confuse the user unless you take that into consideration and explain to them how this is different and how they can use it properly. So you have to understand the rule before you can break it, is the takeaway there. And so we needed to make sure that even though, again, brand new, we can do what we want, we still have to meet what the users are expecting. The second P I want to talk about is process. Process is all about how you do your work. The cliche we'll go with there is the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome. So if you're are you agile right now? Or are you actually waterfall with sprints? And you really think, oh yeah, and that's fine. You can do development that way, but don't expect that just because you're starting a new project, your waterfall with sprints is going to magically turn into proper agile. That's not how it works. My other favorite analogy there is the couple that is having issues, and so they decide we're going to have a baby, thinking that'll solve all their problems, when in fact now you have problems and a screaming human child, which doesn't really help. So with EduTech, like I said, we brought in 2 junior devs to start development. The way they had previously developed their developers was, hey, read the code. That's a great way to learn the code base, get skilled up, find out the rhythms, the patterns, and the commonalities that the developer team has developed over time. That doesn't really work when you're working on a brand new application because there's no code to read. So you cannot just assume that everyone has intimate knowledge of the code base and this is how it works. And this actually was also a little bit of a problem for the 8th layers when we brought on, because we had to ask, hey, we know we have to use this existing API endpoint, but we don't know what API endpoint to use. And they say, oh, just use whatever was using in the old application. But we don't know what the old application is. We don't have any experience with that. So their process, we had to work with their process in terms of how do we actually get our developers into the ecosystem so that we can all be working and rowing in the same direction. The other thing about that is your estimation is always going to be influenced by what you've done before. So if you're used to this feature taking this long, you're going to expect that based on my previous knowledge, this is how long this new feature is going to take. That's not true because you're working with something different and new. And so you really have to take that into consideration. For food at home, we did not have a design for the first few months of development. I think this is fairly common because usually you have many fewer designers than you do developers, and you can't always assign your number of your designers on a project when you need them to. So we were working with wireframes, and we were doing sort of our best guess that this has to work in this flow. And again, it worked fine. When we got the design, we said, okay, most of this works. We had to do some adaptation, but it did require rework. And we were told that this actually wasn't that uncommon because, again, it's not uncommon for that particular organization to have not had the number of designers they needed to. And so their process is always, we're going to do some work, then we're going to get a design, then we're going to do more rework. The process doesn't get fixed just because it's a new application. It just gets applied into the new application. So you have to consider what your assumptions are when we're going through that. The third P I want to talk about is planning. Planning refers to the constraints that timelines impose on every project. And we'll say the inherent unknowns of exploration, where I mean, you're doing something new. Because when you're working on a new project, your direction can be a little aimless. And it's really hard to take into account the things what are the phrase, known unknowns and unknown unknowns. You don't know what those are because you're kind of working in you're exploring into a new area. Time is the ultimate constraint. You can always push your deadline back, but you're not like giving yourself more time. You're actually just changing the scope of your project. And dev organizations frequently omit volatility and change at management in their estimations. We just go, we're going to do a new thing. And we think this new thing should take X amount of time in a vacuum, but they don't take into account the fact that they've never done X thing before, or they've never done it in this way. The mindset tends to be, well, that exists already, so it can't be that hard to build because I know someone did it. So with EduTech, the biggest thing we ran into with planning, like I said, so they brought in 3 new developers and 2 new junior developers. They more than doubled their dev team size. The way they had developed in the past was everyone focuses on a single vertical slice of the application or feature, and they just power through it. The more people we throw at it, within mythical man-month laws, the faster we can get it done. And that worked with a team of 4 or 5. When you double that, suddenly when you slice up those vertical slices, you have more bottlenecks, you have more merge conflicts. And now, not only are we not getting as much work done, we're actually having a lot of regressions because everyone's touching the same thing. Especially with junior developers, they don't necessarily know what to look for when they're doing their merging. So you have find a bug, fix it, someone else is in that same area of the code, they merge in, and suddenly you have the same bug because they merged back over it. So this was a big thing we had to work with them on, which was opening up multiple swim lanes so that we can have more than one feature being worked on at a time to actually take advantage of our larger team. This actually also goes back a little bit to having a legacy code base. When you know a legacy code base, you can kind of estimate or kind of suss out, oh, I think this is going to make this change here. When you're building something entirely different, you can't always make those things because you haven't seen that part of the code base before. So when I make this change, I don't know how it's going to affect other things. With food at home, the biggest thing that we had was They wanted everything to be using their own internal component library. And again, this gets to that internal UX consistency. And that's great because that means when you're on Android, when you're on iOS, they all work the same way. And they wanted React to work the same way, except they hadn't built that much stuff in React using this new component library. So when we got around to actually trying to implement these features, it turned out that a lot of them weren't built. And that was fine. It actually helped them a lot because their internal team got to see how this stuff worked in production, got to see some of the problems and fix them. But none of that was actually factored into the original estimate. So all of a sudden, we're not only building this new product, we're also building out the internal component libraries that can be used somewhere else. So definitely saving them time, but not actually saving us time that we thought we were going to get when we estimated out originally. And so that did work, but you have to check your assumptions because you can't just say, oh, I think this is going to work because it's a new thing. This is my last P. And if you remember one P, it should be this one, mostly because I cheated and it kind of incorporates all of them. But so paradigms is the biggest thing. The point of doing Greenfield development is because you want to do something different. Maybe you're switching frameworks, maybe you're switching languages, maybe you're just trying to pay down technical debt because there's too much and it's easier just to rewrite the whole thing. But if you have the same people using the training they've already had and the knowledge they've already had and just jump into something new, they're going to be working under the same paradigms they've always been. They can have, there are advantages of new technology they can take advantage of. They might be able to implement something in a different way, but they're still going to be operating in their old ways of thinking if you don't take the time to teach them, train them, and have them practice. If you don't do those things, you might find yourself making some of the same mistakes, either specifically or categorically, and that sort of defeats the whole point of doing Greenfield development, which is we want to do something different. With EduTech, and I apologize, this one's going to get a little bit technical. I will try to keep it high level, but the old patterns die, like old habits die hard. So the specific example I want to give is, so we talked about districts. We want to have a select, which is a drop down of all of my districts. Now, when we built this new application, we use TypeScript, which allows us to know the shape of the object we're working with. So we go to the API, we get the list of districts. I know exactly what data is included in that. For this list, all I need is the name of the district and display it. Great. I know how that call should work. I need to go get that, display the name. In the old application, it was written in Angular, it was written in TypeScript, but it was written in TypeScript where all the types were any, which essentially means it was written in JavaScript. For those non-technical minded, that means you don't know what you're getting in any given point, just based on the code. So the way they took advantage, or the way they worked around this was every time they wanted to display a district name, you'd pass in an ID. And so we know in order to display a district, I have to have an ID. And then when that ID gets placed in, it makes a call back to the API and says, give me all the information for that district. And then I will use that data to display the name. It worked for their application. It did what it needed to do. When they got around to building this new district dropdown field, they said, hey, we already have a way to display district names. It's this component. So they pulled it out of the old one and put it in the new one. It works. When you click the list, the names display. Eventually, what actually happened was you clicked on the drop-down list, there was a big list of nothing. And the names would randomly start appearing into it. And it took about 30 seconds for the entire list of district names to load. And this was filed as a bug, and I was looking at it and I was going, how could that, so not only how can this work, I literally don't understand how they're randomly appearing. That doesn't make any sense. I know what should happen is we grab the list of district names, we grab the district information and display it. How's it coming up randomly? And so when I looked at it, sure enough, we grab the list of districts, which again, because we're in this new application, we know the entire shape of that data. We know that a name exists. And then we use the ID out of that to go make a callback to that. So not only is it slow, or not only is it inefficient and doesn't make a lot of sense logically, it's also extremely slow because rather than one call to the API, we're making one call to the API and then one call for every single individual district to load a list. So that would just be an example of, we have this thing that works. Why would we spend more time to develop it? Because it works. Well, the answer is it doesn't really work. It technically functions, but it's not fitting with our new paradigm of we know the shape of our data. We know what we're working with. This is how we make it performant. This is literally why we built it this way, is to do this stuff differently. And then I'm cheating on this last one because The fact that we brought in a new team to work on the front end means that we did not have those same internal expectations, or we'll say ossified ideas in our head of how things should work. And I'm also a little bit promoting Eighth Light because, hey, Eighth Light came and did the whole thing. It was great, right? No, it was the fact that we did not have those pre-existing conceptions that allowed us to do things differently. And we still got internal stuff. We talked to their internal teams. We talked to their backend, like I said, we talked to their component library teams, and we were able to do things, we'll say, in their flavor, but we were able to use our existing knowledge of how we thought things should be built in order to build this. I will say, again, developers always say, build it right, but build it the way that we thought it should be built. So to sum up, again, there's really no such thing as true greenfield development. All development will have external encumbrances for commercially viable definitions of all. So the nice thing about this is most of these takeaways are also applicable to all software projects. That's the other big twist. Because if there's no such thing as a greenfield, that means everything is brownfield, which means this is always applicable. Focus on your processes. You cannot fix bad processes just by using them to make something new. The adage I'll give you there is beating your head against a different wall is still going to give you the same headache. You need to plan for success. Time does not wait for you. You need to account that the time you have will drive your outcome, same as all development projects. And you need to plan for both variance and problems that will impact what you actually can accomplish. And then, of course, paradigm shifts. You need to invest in the time and resources to shift your team's thinking if you want your team to think differently to make something different.